But look at this thing. It's freaking beautiful, at least to me. After over a year with nothing, we are finally starting to see some new motherboards for the Am5 platform. And equally important, we're starting to get a few more white options out there. The competition is finally starting to heat up, which is probably why Gigabyte named this one Ice. That's right, today we're going to be looking at the Gigabyte Aorus B650 Elite AX Ice. But first, the options for a white B650 motherboard has been pretty limited since launch, with ASUS, MSI, and ASUS ROG having a couple of models out, basically propping up the whole market. Now, Gigabyte is stepping up with their Aorus B650 Elite AX Ice. You remember when names used to be like short and less than a sentence? Looking at you, NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4070 Ti Super. Okay, look, admittedly, the color of your motherboard doesn't really matter. I mean, your CPU, RAM, GPU, none of that knows what this thing looks like. At the end of the day, all that matters is performance. But look at this thing. It's freaking beautiful, at least to me. But none of that matters if this board can't deliver. So let's talk about the features and specs of it. First, let's take a look at power delivery. The board has a 12.2-2 VRM rated at 60 amps per stage. And while that is nowhere near the top of the product stack when it comes to power delivery, it's still more than sufficient for pretty much everyone's needs. We didn't have any problems during testing with a 7950X, and that was using Eco Mode, Stock, and PBNJ. You guys want a PB&J? So during testing, we didn't have any issues running a 7950X in this thing with PBO enabled. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is the board I would go with for a 7950X, but over-designing the VRM has been a trend we've seen lately with a lot of motherboard manufacturers, and it really comes more down to marketing than actual performance. Don't get me wrong, your CPU loves clean, stable power, and it's the VRM's job to deliver that consistently, but I don't think there's really any need for 110 amp, 22 stage VRM like some other boards are packing. And it's actually nice to see Gigabyte not lean into that trend and dial it back a little bit to give you a good balance of functionality and cost. So it probably comes down to Gigabyte being a little more realistic about the market segment that this board targets. Most people shopping this mid-tier B650 market probably going to pair this with something like a 7700X or a 7800X3D, which is a crazy efficient chip and doesn't need anything insane to power it. Would I like to see something a little more robust for future-proofing, especially since AMD has acknowledged they're going to keep this socket around all the way until 2026. And if the trends with AM4, which is still getting new CPUs, is any indication, it could be a lot longer than that. But for today, I think this is going to be solid enough, at least for this generation of CPUs, and probably the next. Looking at RAM, this board has support for up to 192 gigabytes. That is 4 48 gig sticks for you math challenge folks, and support speeds up to 8,000 mega transfers. Now, that's what the spec sheet says. Our kit we use for our test bench tops out at 6,000. It's a 32 gig kit from G.Skill. So we couldn't verify that statement. What I can tell you is I can almost guarantee you're not getting 8,000 or anywhere close to it with all 4 slots populated. In fact, you'd be lucky to get it with slots 2 and 4 populated. What I can tell you is we had no issues running it with Expo enabled at 6,000 MTS, going through all of our benchmarking and everything. So with that being the sweet spot for RAM, even though AMD CPUs now support faster than that, I would still probably look to top out at a 6,000 kit if you're going for stability. Onto the storage side of things, we have 3 M.2 slots with your primary slot running at PCIe 5, your 2 secondary ones at PCIe Gen 4. There are boards with significantly more M.2 slots than this, but realistically, you're not going to be running more than 3 sticks anyway. And if you are, you're probably not shopping in this budget B650 tier to begin with. The heat sinks not only look great, but they have a solid feel and should dissipate heat effectively especially if you're paying attention to the airflow in your case. Along with the 3 M.2 slots, the board also has, we almost lost the board there. Along with the 3 M.2 slots, the board also has support for up to 4 SATA connections. Finally, let's take a look at the connectivity on the board. And I do think this is an area where the budget pricing is starting to show itself a little bit. For the rear I/O, we have HDMI and DisplayPort, support for BIOS flashback, and plenty of USB-A with 4 2.0 ports, 5 3.2 Gen 1, and 2 3.2 Gen 2 ports. Where I find the I/O lacking is in USB Type-C, with only one rear Type-C connector. The board does have a front panel header for a 20 gig port, but I have seen more and more peripherals starting to launch with Type-C, which is amazing. Like, it was time for micro to go away, and it's really time for us to start getting away from USB-A. We're 30 years old at this point. I don't even remember when it came out. With only one Type-C connector on the rear, it's probably not going to be long before you're hitting Amazon looking for a nice USB hub. The board also has 3 PCIe expansion slots, with the primary slot rated at PCIe 4x16, and the 2 secondary slots are only PCIe 3x1, which is going to limit their functionality some. So that's going to be something you want to pay attention to if that matters for your use case. As far as the primary slot only being rated for Gen 4, I don't think that's really an issue. Even the 4090 is still just a Gen 4 PCIe card. Will next generation move to Gen 5? More than likely. But again, if you're shopping this budget market segment, is a $2,000 GPU really what you're going to be paired with? As far as internal headers go, you have more than enough USB 2, RGB, fan, and pump headers for basically any type of system configuration you want to build out. As far as quality of life features, you have easy latch on both the primary PCIe slot as well as your M.2s, and the board again supports BIOS flashback, which really makes updating easy, especially if you're getting this board after a new generation of CPUs launch, or there's been a lot of BIOS updates since this board initially comes out and you're building with it. It's always good to update the BIOS before you actually build out, if you can. So overall, would I recommend this board? Yeah, after playing with it for a couple of days and going over everything, this is probably my favorite of the mid-tier boards out there for Am5. It is definitely my favorite when it comes to white, which you only have a couple of options in the B650 range, and then you have a couple of X670-E boards, but now you're jumping up a whole price bracket. All in all, I would say if you're doing a white build and around that $200 price range is your budget, this is probably the board I'm going for. We are back with another entry into our AMD Am5 budget board battle. And today we'll be taking a look at MSI's X670-p Pro Wi-Fi. Now, we chose to look at this board today for a few reasons. One, at $229, it is one of the lowest cost entries into our series so far. Also, we noticed that we've leaned heavily into ASUS and Gigabyte, and while most of their recent issues have been resolved through BIOS updates, it's understandable that a lot of consumers are still kind of hesitant to buy from those brands, especially with the added customer service issues from ASUS around their RMA process. Finally, I've noticed that this board seems to be paired a lot in these Micro Center bundle deals, giving even more savings to consumers and helping you guys build a budget system. But that probably leaves you wondering, is this board a good choice for me? While we go over the features of this board today, we'll be getting it ready to go into our Praxis test bench from Primo Chill, and we'll have a later video going into detail about the performance and stability of this particular board paired with some different options that we have here ready for testing. We also already have this same board up and running in a budget build being tested by one of our producers with a 7900X, a 2070 Super, and DDR5 6000 from G-Skill. So make sure, if you haven't already, take a second to go down there, like and subscribe so you can come back and see the full details of this board. And while we're on the topic of subscribing, we are quickly approaching 1,000 subscribers, and we plan to do a huge subscriber-only giveaway and a live event as soon as we hit that mark. So again, make sure you go down, click that button, subscribe to the channel. That way you can stay up to date on all of the latest products that we're testing, as well as have a chance to be entered into that drawing. Now, typically this is the part where we talk about MSI's marketing, where we get everything unboxed. But today, I just want to dive straight into talking about the specs and features of this specific motherboard. Just looking at the board, you can already see a huge departure from the typical RGB-centric, dragon-themed, gamer-oriented approach that MSI takes on a lot of their higher-end boards. And this makes sense, as MSI describes the Pro series as business elegance, stepping away from the gamer enthusiast crowd and targeting a more business-centric customer. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this is a bad choice for enthusiasts, especially as we've seen a lot of people start to trend away from that RGB-centric, looks like it should be behind a DJ booth at a rave style designing. This board packs a solid 14 2-in-1 power design rated at 80 amps, and while not as over the top as some of the other boards, it should be more than sufficient to adequately power any of the AMD 7000 series chips. In fact, as you'll see soon, we're about to throw a 7950X in here for this build. It also supports DDR5 up to 6,000 megatransfers a second. Now, that's another area where on paper it falls short of pretty much all X670E and most B650E boards that are rated at 62 to 6400. But again, that's another area where specs on paper can be misleading, with AMD themselves coming outright and stating that 6,000 is gonna be the sweet spot for all Am5 series chips. Not to mention that stability issues, especially on this new Am5 platform, seem to ramp up exponentially as you try and increase RAM speeds past 6,000. Looking at the expansion slots, we have 1, 2, 3 PCIe X16 slots, all rated at Gen 4, as well as one PCIe X1 slot, not something that you see on a lot of these Am5 boards. The top 2 primary PCIe expansion slots are also steel reinforced to handle some of the behemoth GPUs out there. One thing that is missing is a quick release or Q latch, something like ASUS has and even MSI has on some of their higher end boards. And I have to admit, that's a feature that I've become pretty used to, especially with all the testing we do and switching out of GPUs and components. It's really convenient to have, but only you can decide if that's something that's gonna actually matter to you. For storage, the board packs 4 M.2 slots, with the primary slot being rated at Gen 5, while the other 3 are rated at Gen 4. Now, another thing of note is there is only a built-in heatsink over the main Gen 5 M.2 slot, and that might be something, if you're using multiple M.2 storages, that could be an issue for you. However, a lot of Gen 4 storage comes with available heatsinks, so again, something you're gonna have to decide if it actually affects you and your build. One thing of note with the M.2 storage is none of these 4 slots share lanes with the PCIe expansion slots, which is not something we usually see on these budget boards and is a nice touch to have. That's not gonna matter for most people, but for the few of you that it does, it really does. Moving into the rear I/O, the first thing you'll notice is MSI doesn't pre-install the I/O shield. It's worth noting that this is the first Am5 board we've tested that's come like this. It's not a huge deal, but It's one of those convenience factors that I'm not really sure why MSI went in this direction with this particular board. Unfortunately, the story on the I/O doesn't get much better from there with only 6 USB Type-A slots. Now, thankfully, they are all rated at Gen 3 or better. However, this still falls well short of the 10 or more USB Type-A slots we've seen on most of these boards so far. There are 2 Type-C ports, and I'm still wondering when we're gonna ever see more than 2 Type-C ports on a rear I/O, but that's a topic for a later discussion. It also has a full complement of audio jacks as well as BIOS flashback. Now that we've covered all the main features and specs of this board, let's start getting things in there and getting it ready to go into our test bench for further testing. Okay, so let's start getting this thing put together now. A few parts we have going in today. While we're still waiting on the rest of our test build to come together, we have a AMD Ryzen 7950X CPU. As I was saying earlier, I really want to push this board to see what we can get out of it. We're going to be pairing that with Triton G-Skill DDR5 CL36 RAM. Now, in our other build we already have put together, we're also using Triton Z DDR5 RAM, except we're using the CL30. The big difference is that is a SK Hynix kit, while this one is Samsung die. And finally, we'll just be throwing in our Crucial P3 Plus. This is a drive that already has Windows preloaded that we use in a lot of our testing. When you go with these budget builds, a lot of times one of the things you sacrifice on is VRM and power delivery. And while this one is much lower than a lot of the X670E boards, or really all of the X670E boards, and most of the B650E, it shouldn't have an issue handling something as demanding as a 7950X, but I guess we're gonna see. I've had a lot of luck with this kit. We've actually used this in a couple of tests so far. It's been really good. This was the original kit I had in our editing rig build, the Demon PC that you've seen in a few other videos. While we were in the process of switching out the motherboard that burned up from ASUS, we went ahead and switched out new RAM and saved this kit to use in our test builds. So I know for a fact that this is a solid kit. We're not gonna have any issues with it. And should give us a pretty good comparison for this versus some of the other kits out there. Stay out of the camera's way so you guys can see what we're doing. Take off. Ready to get this thing dropped into our test bench. I genuinely love the design of this Praxis wet bench from Primo Chill. You basically install your motherboard standoffs for whatever size board you're working with. These screws come through, it makes it incredibly easy to line up, and there are different size fittings for any board you're trying to build. All right, take two. I still really love the design of this Praxis wet bench from Primo Chill. It does make installing any type of motherboard easy. So you just slide it over the standoffs that you pre-installed, and there's some nuts that you use to screw it down. I'm not gonna make you guys sit here and watch me do all of that. I'm just gonna talk about wrap up and final thoughts on this. If you're not gonna come back and check out the final benchmarking video, like what are our thoughts on this motherboard? So I think this is a solid budget option. Now, I wouldn't put it up there with any of the X670E boards or really any of the higher B650E boards. However, at the price point for $229, it's a solid buy and a solid motherboard that's gonna give you probably all of the features you need and 99% of the features that you want, especially a gaming build. I mean, you have PCIe Gen 4, which is all you need, considering even the 4090 is still only a Gen 4 card. You have a Gen 5 M.2 slot, as well as 3 other Gen 4 M.2s. Only takes DDR5 up to 6,000 megatransfers. However, 6,000 is the sweet spot for AMD right now, and anything over that, we've had a lot of stability issues trying to get RAM clocked over that. My only concern would be the VRM being slightly less robust than some of the other options. While we do testing, I'm gonna actually pull thermals from the VRM to see what temps it gets up to. Now, my gut tells me that this is still gonna be solid. You're not gonna have any issues with temperature or anything like that with your VRM. I mean, really, that's it. This board pretty much has everything you would need, and it comes in at a price that's more than affordable. So a while back, I did a review of this board, and at the time I said, this might be the best kept secret from ASUS. Well, a little bit of time has gone by. The X670 stock has kind of stabilized. The B series boards have come out, and I wanted to look back, do a deeper dive into this and see, do I still feel the same way? So if you're not new to the channel, you already know what I'm talking about. But in case you are, today we're gonna dig into ASUS's ROG Strix X670E-A gaming Wi-Fi board. This is one of ASUS's mid-tier boards for AMD's new Am5 platform, and still one of the only white-ish form factor boards available. So I say white-ish because, I mean, that's what it really is. ASUS technically calls this Moonlight White, but it's really more of a exposed metal silver color with a few white accents here and there. I still think it looks great, and it is a pretty sexy board in my opinion. So before I jump into giving you my thoughts on the board after having it for a couple of months, let's hear some marketing speak from ASUS. So ASUS wants us to jump in with the ROG Strix and suit up for the next gen with stylish ROG Strix X670E-A gaming. So some of the highlights of this board, of course, it's socket AM5 compatible. It features 4 M.2 slots, that's 2 Gen 4 and 2 Gen 5, as well as PCIe 5.0, 4, and 3 support. The board features ASUS's Team Power architecture with 16+2 power phases, as well as high-quality alloy chokes and durable capacitors. The board has a true 8-layer PCB, and helping keep everything cool, it is coupled with very substantial dual heat sinks on the VRM, as well as included heat sinks for all 4 M.2 slots. On the rear I/O, this board features pretty much everything you could want, with 8 USB 3.2 Gen 2 slots, 7 being Type A, 1 Type C, another USB Type C Gen 3.2 by 2, as well as BIOS flashback, clear CMOS, and a whole host of audio-visual connections. So that's what ASUS wants you to know. What are my thoughts after having this for a couple of months? Well, first let's talk about the VRM. So ASUS uses 16+2 power stages on that. And I said it before in a previous video, but it's worth touching on now. A lot of the X670E boards you have, you're gonna see 20+2, 24+1 and 1. It's not that this board is
underpowered. Those boards are way overpowered. It is completely unnecessary, and honestly, it's just an easy way to drive the MSRP of a board up. It's very inexpensive for a manufacturer to do that versus the return they get in profitability. The power supply on this is phenomenal. Delivers more than you could possibly want, even if you're using a Ryzen 7950X. And to be fair, if you are using a 7950X, it can be a power-hungry beast, but you should check out some of the videos on using the 105 watt eco mode, which is what I've been using, and you literally get 98% of the performance for 30 to 40% less power consumption. It is unquestionable that you should be running your CPU like that. So one of the other features of this board that I don't want to overlook is it uses ASUS's quick release for the PCIe 5.0 slots, as well as the Q-Latch system for M.2s, which makes installing and uninstalling your components an absolute breeze. It's a nice touch that is expected on a board at this level. As far as cooling goes, while it may be a little hard to see at this angle, the thickness of the heat sinks over the VRM is substantial. And they do phenomenal at dissipating heat, keeping everything running cool, and the AMD processors in this generation can be not just power hungry, but a little demanding in the thermal department. So that's, again, a nice touch. You also have the heat sinks over all 4 of your M.2 slots. So the way that breaks down is you have an M.2 Gen 5 right here, another M.2 Gen 5 right here, and then a paired Gen 4 slots right there. This big heatsink in the middle is covering the chipset to help that stay cool. Another nice touch right here is on the PCIe Gen 5 slot. You can see that it is reinforced to give it a little bit of extra stability, and that can be pretty useful because some of these new GPUs are chonkers. So anything to help make that slot a little more rigid, a little more stable, definitely appreciate it whenever they include that in the motherboard. Did you guys see that? Oh. So I mentioned M.2 Gen 5 support as well as PCIe 5.0 support, right? Is that something you really need? Or is that just a way for the manufacturers to drive the price up? Because a lot of the B series boards don't come with that. Well, the answer is yes and no. So AMD does tend to hang on to their platforms for a while, so there's a good chance, especially if you're buying a first gen board, that you're gonna reuse it for future product cycles, and you may eventually need that. But as of right now, both NVIDIA's new 40 series as well as AMD's 7000 series GPUs about to launch are still PCIe Gen 4. And even when they make that jump to Gen 5 in the future, as we saw with prior generations when they moved from 3 to 4, the previous still worked just fine. So that might not be a feature that you're going to need for a while. The same goes for the M.2 Gen 5. There are M.2 Gen 5 storages starting to come out. Samsung has one. I've seen a few more hit the market, but they are insanely expensive right now. They're insanely fast, but it is completely unnecessary, even for the most high-end power users. You can grab something like MSI Spatium M480 for right at $200 right now on the 2 terabyte size. And I've seen the Samsung 980 Pros under $170 on sale for 2 terabytes. Both of those sticks have 7,000 read and write. Like, you're not gonna need faster than that. You're not gonna notice a difference in 99% of your daily usage. So I would say, no, they're not necessary. If you really wanna save a buck and go with a little bit cheaper board that only has Gen 4 support, you're gonna be just fine. it'll be years before that actually matters to you. Looking at the rear I/O of the board, this is one of the spots where I do think ASUS maybe left off some features that I would have liked to have seen. So the main thing is USB 4 support. While this board has a ton of USB 3.2 Gen 2 and Gen 2x2 ports, including USB 4 would have been nice, especially in the $400 price range. One of the things this board does include that is absolutely critical for a board at this level is BIOS flashback as well as clear CMOS button. So you're gonna see this a lot when a new product launches, especially early in its life cycle. ASUS has already dropped 3 or 4 BIOS updates for this board, and this is the tip that I wanted to leave you guys with. If you get this, or really any X670 board right now, you're gonna wanna update your BIOS before you do your initial post. So one of the things that have been fixed, along with a host of performance and compatibility issues, is improvements in the initial posting whenever you're building your system. Now, how do you update your BIOS if your system's not built? Well, that's where BIOS flashback comes in, and we're gonna do a video on that soon. In fact, I'll have a complete tutorial on that coming out in just a few days, but all you need is another computer that's working and a USB 2.0 flash drive. Basically, you'll download the new BIOS file on that. You stick it right into the BIOS flashback USB port on the back of the motherboard. And all you have to do is connect your power supply's ATX and EPS connectors, hit the BIOS flashback button, and that is it. You're done. Takes about 5 minutes. It'll completely update your BIOS. Then you can go ahead and assemble your computer. That is going to significantly improve your initial post speed, as well as your performance right out of the box. If your computer's already built, it's much easier. You could just go into the BIOS, go to the update, and download the new BIOS, and it'll do it for you. But it's really important if you're getting one of these. I can almost guarantee it's been sitting in the warehouse since ASUS put out their last BIOS update, and it will greatly improve your experience if you just knock that out up front.